Thank you for coming out to Baruch College on this rainy December evening. I really appreciate your fortitude in getting here through the drenching rain that we've been dealing with all day. This is the last Marx Global Insights event of the semester. It is entitled Columbia's Peace Process at the Crossroads. And we're going to be discussing the peace process that formally began in Colombia with the 2016 Havana Accords between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, that ended officially, technically speaking, the 5-decade-old civil conflict between the Colombian government and that organization. The conflict between the FARC and the Colombian government is part of a broader conflict that has involved other guerrilla groups such as the National Liberation Army, the ELN, paramilitaries, criminal organizations that have killed approximately 260,000 Colombians during this time and caused 7 million to flee their homes. The historic peace process, peace agreements led to the demobilization of much of the FARC, support for the transition into civilian life, a commitment on the part of the state to rural development plans long advocated for by the FARC and by peasants' organizations, accords on political participation in post-conflict Colombia, and agreements regarding victims and the control of the drug trade. The peace process itself, however, has been rough in practice. It was narrowly rejected by a national referendum before being put in place by the Colombian government. Many groups that were not included in the accords have remained in the field and expanded their footprint, their territorial footprint across Colombia. Drug production, indeed, has significantly increased. And large portions of the FARC have not demobilized. Since the peace accords, 702 peasant leaders have been killed and 135 former guerrillas have been murdered since up until May of 2019. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the Marx Chair of Western Hemisphere Affairs here in the Marx School at Baruch College. And we have tonight 3 distinguished experts on Colombia who will be discussing the state of the peace accords and the future of Colombia's peace. Our first presenter to my far left is Angelica Duran Martinez. She is an associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. She has her PhD from Brown, but perhaps even more critically, a Bachelor of Arts from the Universidad de los Andes.
No, Colombia, right? Nacional.
Nacional, so, pardon me. The Universidad Nacional in Colombia. In 2018, she published a book entitled The Politics of Drug Violence, Criminals, Cops, and Politicians in Colombia and Mexico with Oxford University Press. The book won the Best Book Prize from the Peter Katzenstein Prize for Best First Book in International Relations, Comparative Politics, and Political Economy, and the Best Book Prize from the International Association for the Study of Organized Crime. Our next speaker to my immediate left is Sarah Zuckerman Daly. She is an assistant professor at Columbia University. She completed her PhD in political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she is the author of Organized Violence After Civil War, The Geography of Recruitment in Latin America. The book received an honorable mention from the Conflict Research Society's 2017 Best Book Prize. And she has published articles in the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Politics, Journal of Peace Research, Political Analysis, Conflict Management, and Peace. Our third speaker to my right is Vonda Feldman-Brown. She also received her doctorate in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and she is the author of several books, including The Extinction Market, Wildlife Trafficking and How to Counter It, Narco Noir, Mexico's Cartels, Cops, and Corruption, Cartels, Cops, and Corruption, Militants, Criminals, and Warlords. The third book is Militants, Criminals, and Warlords, The Challenge of Local Governance in an Age of Disorder, which she co-authored with Shadi Hamid and Harold Trincunis. The next book is Aspirations and Ambivalence, Strategies and Realities of Counterinsurgency and State Building in Afghanistan. And finally, her first book was Shooting Up, Counterinsurgency and the War on Drugs. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming here tonight. And I was going to start out with a question to Vanda. Why did Santos pursue the peace process initially? What were his goals, and what were the limitations of his strategy?
Well, thank you, Desmond, for inviting me. Good evening to all of you. You know, there were multiple motivations for the Santos administration, and I would say the most important one was the change in Colombian society and how it was perceiving the conflict. So the early phase of the 2000 decades was one of the previous president, Alvaro Uribe, gaining a lot of support by significantly strengthening the security military capacity of the Colombian forces and really pushing back against the FARC and what many people came to perceive as the disastrous peace process in the 1990s that did not produce any kind of peace and resulted in the FARC significantly strengthening territorial presence, including through using the territory that was the demobilized zone where the FARC was located. And that situation coincided with the expansion of the paramilitary forces who later came to be known as AUC. So after that phase of significant conflict expansion and bitter disappointment, you have Uribe and the military pushback and a very strong decade of significant military reversals, significant changes on the battlefield with the security forces also through the US Plan Colombia becoming much stronger. So in the 1990s, Colombian security forces were extraordinarily badly designed, very weak, often really contracted out the war to the brutal paramilitaries. And through Plan Colombia, they become much more competent, much more strengthened, and the battlefield changes. But by 2007, 2008, the battlefield pretty much stalls. And it stalls at a much lower level of conflict that was there a decade before, but the notion that the FARC could simply be defeated became elusive. Now, coinciding with that stalemate on the battlefield is also a real struggle of the Colombian government with their counterinsurgency policy, not simply the two sides of it, not simply the hold, the clear, but particularly the hold and the build. So in many ways, the struggles that the United States is experiencing in Afghanistan was in a smaller version experienced by the Colombian military. And there was a whole ambitious set of what was called a consolidation plan and went through different versions that sought to build up territories liberated from the FARC by delivering governance, delivering government presence, often for the first time. And that really did not work. And it's a very significant background to what's happening with the peace process today. But the Santos administration is essentially realizing that the entire consolidation project, that the build part of the counterinsurgency is not working. And so they're thinking, what can we do differently? And that becomes the critical impetus for starting the negotiations with the FARC really in 2012, and there is already precursors to it in 2010, 2011, while Uribe is still in power. Several people around Santos are starting to move in that way. And so this is the setting, changed battlefield with much stronger military, but nonetheless a stalemate and real struggle of the build governance project that pushes for, let's do something different, let's negotiate again.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Angelica now, what are the conditions on the ground in Colombia today, and what effect has Duque's election? So there was a shift in presidential administration from Santos, who was the president at the time of the Accords, to Luis Fernando Duque, who is now the president, who was elected in 2017, if I recall correctly. What effect Duque's election has had on the peace process?
Well, it depends on who you ask, right? But I will say, so I think you can interpret what's happening in Colombia today in two different ways. If people have been following the news, they know that Colombia, like many other Latin American countries, over the past 2-3 weeks has been facing a wave of protest and mobilization on the ground. And I will say a lot of that protest is related to the discontent about how Duque has been implemented the peace agreement, but that's not the only thing that people have been mobilizing. So I will say there is in some ways, you can interpret what's happening in Colombia now as a reflection of both the good and the bad things that have happened with the peace process. The good, because I think in many ways people are mobilizing in opposition to Duque's kind of slow implementation of the peace agreement, but also about other things that have been problems for Colombia for decades and that people were not mobilizing against before, like the fear of a regressive tax reform or the fear of a reform that will further weaken labor conditions in Colombia. So those are things that are not really new in Colombia. And in fact, many governments before have implemented policies that are pretty much kind of weaken the labor conditions and regressive tax policies. And people have mobilized against them, but not as strongly as today. And I think that's partially a reflection of the fact that after the demobilization of the FARC, there's been an opening of a political space in which there's more space for presenting and mobilizing in favor of socially progressive ideas without the fear of being stigmatized as leftists and FARC. So I think that that's the good side of the story. The bad side, of course, is that there is a slow implementation of the peace agreement that actually Duque campaigned for. He campaigned not with, I would say not with a platform that was against the peace agreement, because that was just politically costly, but one that was clearly against some of the strongest components of reform within the peace agreement, like things related with land reform and socioeconomic reforms. And most importantly, all the elements in the transitional justice setup. And he won with that platform, and it was clear that he was not necessarily going to reverse completely a peace agreement, but definitely slow down the implementation. And to be completely fair, I think the peace agreement started having problems of implementation even before Duque was elected, just because it was a very, it is a very comprehensive agreement. And I think there was not much thought process beforehand of what was the institutional basis that was going to sustain that agreement. And that started with Santos. But then with Duque, you add to that problem of implementation and weakness in institutions and the weakness of the Colombian state on the ground, you add to that the political slowdown or the political effort to slow down the processes. So people are reacting to that. But as I said, I think there are many reasons on the ground why people are mobilizing, but of course for a big sector of the population is the feeling that there hasn't been a strong political commitment to the peace process and that there is uncertainty about how it will be, how it will keep being implemented. And some of the most important components of the peace agreement, Duque really has not tried to implement them in many ways. Things like having a clear legal status for the benefits that will allow coca growers to get to be able to access some of the benefits in the crop substitution program. And the other thing that's happening in Colombia now, of course, and I think that comes since the moment when the peace started to be negotiated, is this sense of polarization. But I think it's a polarization that is not as clear that you will just say is left and right, because I think it's much more complex than that. But it's clear a polarization of people who are much more pro-Uribe, and I will say this very clearly, is much more pro-Uribe, and then the rest of the country, I will say. However, some of the opinion polls that have been released recently show that even though there is polarization, so according to the polls, about 55% of the population support the recent mobilizations, and about 40% are against. So there is some polarization, but it seems that the majority of the people are supporting somehow the mobilization and the reasons why people are mobilizing. And among young people, that support is even higher. So about 70% of the population, young population, are supporting the mobilization. So I think the situation on the ground, it's a combination of like some signs that things have changed in Colombia, at the same time a sense that there's still like all these really deep, complicated problems in the implementation of the peace process, and more generally like just very old problems with inequality in Colombia, which are not new by any means. And I think that those are also being mixed in this situation. And I think that that's kind of, I can go on this, but I don't want to take too much time.
I wanted to follow up on that and go back to the 2016 referendum. And if you look at a map of Colombia and the results during the 2016 referendum, the municipalities that voted in favor of the referendum tended to be on the periphery of the country, away from the Andes, in the areas most heavily affected by the FARC, whereas the vote against it tended to be in more central areas, large cities, high in the Andes. What do you think accounts for that polarization?
So I think with the referendum, I think, again, there is polarization that has to do with, on the one hand, the position or the rejection towards the FARC, which I think is very strong for obvious reasons. You know, people were just tired, just felt that the FARC didn't have any legitimacy and that any attempt to negotiate with them really didn't make sense. And so I think that there is that legitimate opposition to the FARC. Then, of course, you have the more pro-Uribe extreme discourse that is much more, we just don't want to negotiate in any way. And then I think there was polarization again, but I think complex polarization, because I think one thing that was clear with the referendum is that part of the problem was also that the Santos government took for granted that people will support the agreement. And because of that, didn't make an effort in just educating, like just telling people what was in the agreement and trying to countermine a very strong discourse from the Uribistas and from Uribe that the agreement was bad. So I think if had Santos put more emphasis and just paid more attention to how people were feeling on the ground, and instead of taking for granted that people were going to support the agreement, there was a chance that even if the election was closed, that the referendum probably could have passed. It will have been close, because I think even today we still see the same thing. You know, people that don't want any concessions to the FARC, that they don't understand why there will be any salary paid to ex-combatants, or that they don't understand why there will be any form of transitional justice. So yes, there is that polarization, but then there is kind of that sector in the middle that I think is it just needs to be persuaded and worked with instead of just assumed. So.
This one I would add here that this division of people away from the conflict, often being far more skeptical of peace processes and putting far greater demands on accountability for human rights violations is rather frequent. I mean, we see it playing out very much in the Afghanistan setting and negotiations with the Taliban, where the situation is obviously complex in a way that was not the case in Colombia, where the Taliban can potentially fundamentally change the entire political dispensation in the context of the negotiation. But nonetheless, you see the same division. People who are living under Taliban rule or in conflict areas simply want conflict under all, simply want peace under all circumstances, and are far more willing to compromise on issues of political freedom, social freedoms, and don't have any notion of any kind of accountability, whereas people in urban areas tend to be very much opposed. They have much more to lose, but they also have far greater demands. So it's, and we see it in other conflicts, Nigeria, Boko Haram, almost same division.
Sarah, I wanted to ask you, if you could put this peace process in the context of other past peace processes, which have had their successes, but which have also had their failures. And in particular, I'm thinking of the paramilitary demobilization in the 2000s and the FARC-associated peace process in the 1980s.
So I think what's really interesting is there have been these norms of negotiations in Colombia that usually there's some political opening, there's usually amnesty given. Usually these are partial peace agreements where the government negotiates with one group while continuing to put military pressure and actively fighting other groups. And there hasn't been that much opposition to this sort of recipe of negotiation, at least the type of opposition that you're seeing today. And so I've been asking myself and thinking about what has changed. And on the one hand, norms of transitional justice around the world have changed such that amnesty is not necessarily permitted in the same way that it might have been in the past. The International Criminal Court, The Hague, all that sort of changes some of the ability to give blanket amnesty. And so this process had to look a little bit different. You also couldn't just kill off so anyone who opposed the deal couldn't just kill off everybody like they did with Unión Patriótica in the 1980s. And so that wasn't really an option, creating electoral incentives to do it, to do opposition through political and electoral channels. And so I think that those are two of the kind of major differences. That with this process, you see a great deal of opposition in a way that I don't believe that you saw in past processes. The irony is that a lot of the opposition and all of the sort of speaking points of the opposition to this peace process are almost the mirror of the opposition to the process with the paramilitaries between 2003 and 2006. At that moment in time, the same opposition and points were coming from the political left. And they were saying, you're giving amnesty to the paramilitaries, you're not putting them into jail, you're not doing enough to punish them, how about the rights of the victims? How about why should they be allowed to continue to have political influence? At that point, the paramilitaries controlled about 35% of Congress. So why are they allowed to continue with this parapolitica? Why are the paramilitaries, when they demobilize, getting humanitarian assistance, whereas the victims are getting nothing? So a lot of the same exact talking points that were used against Uribe at that point when he was president and negotiating with the paramilitaries now is being used by Uribe and the political right to critique Santos and the process with the FARC. And so the process actually looks relatively similar. If anything, the FARC are getting harsher sentences than the paramilitaries did. And yet the opposition to this process is a lot more robust. In terms of thinking back to Vanda, the question you asked of Vanda about sort of where did this process come from, and it's really a pretty interesting process that Santos was the one that opened these negotiations when he was the hand-picked successor, the Minister of Defense under Uribe. In his inauguration speech, promised to continue Uribe's strategy, and yet, according to Uribistas, betrayed Uribe. And so explaining sort of where this negotiation came from with the FARC is an interesting question. I think under Uribe, there was always the sense that you would have a negotiation with the FARC, that it was put the military pressure on the FARC until the point at which they are so weak that they will negotiate and the negotiation will look like surrender. Whereas, and so Santos opened negotiations, and then I believe there's something idiosyncratic here that happened with him personally wanting to attach his political legacy to a peace process, and realizing that there was no negotiation with the FARC without giving concessions, and such that he was willing to give concessions to get peace. But you wouldn't have necessarily expected that by looking at the history and what his background was, and the fact that he had a lot of the blemishes on his record because he was the defense minister during some of the worst of Colombia's military counterinsurgencies, human rights abuses.
Yeah.
So I agree completely with that. And I think it's interesting, some people will characterize. So Santos is probably, of the current Colombian politicians, is one that has had one of the longest political careers. Mm-hmm. And some people will characterize his career as one that navigates the center pretty successfully, sometimes going more left and sometimes going more right. Mm-hmm. Clearly when he was with Uribe, he was more on the right. But I think he's also a politician that wanted to create some kind of legacy, and that has always been kind of his ideological position. Mm-hmm. And I think there was really, I think it was strategic, but there was also ideological, partially knowing that the one thing that could create a stronger legacy was being able to say, we have been able to negotiate with the FARC. Mm-hmm. Because despite, and I agree absolutely with Sarah, there are many, there's a stronger opposition in this process, but in some ways it's another iteration of the many attempts at peace that have existed in Colombia since the 80s. I will say with two main differences. One is that it actually happened, right? As many problems as we're having with the implementation, there was actually this agreement with the FARC that had been elusive for decades. Mm-hmm. But also it was a very comprehensive agreement, which is very different from any other agreement that has ever been signed in Colombia within a group. And there have been many agreements signed with the M19, with the EPL, with the CRS, smaller groups. And those were all mostly ceasefire agreements that had maybe some things about DDR, some demobilization But the kind of agreement that was signed with the FARC was the most comprehensive agreement that has been signed in Colombia, and I will say arguably in the world, which is one of its advantages and one of its disadvantages, because it also makes it very complicated to implement.
So, speaking of the accord itself, two of the major planks of the accord were comprehensive rural reform and an effort to control the drug trade in Colombia. And I wanted to, and they're very closely interlinked planks, but I wanted to ask Vanda how rural reform is advancing and what implications the peace process is having, what effects the peace process is having on the drug trade in Colombia.
Well, the essence of Colombia's problem, arguably, is the vast disparity between the periphery and the center that goes back decades and centuries, really. And the periphery not being just small outlying border areas, but because of the geography of the country, very large parts of the country. So Colombia is a very bifurcated country where you have key urban centers and close spaces around the urban centers that have been economically thriving, even if socially divided. But nonetheless, then you have very large spaces that are very underdeveloped in very many ways, have been historically underdeveloped. And it's this festering periphery that is, I use periphery in quotation marks because it's very vast territories, that the elite and urban middle class have chosen not to invest because the investments are enormous, and so they allow it to simmer in problems until those problems boil over to a critical level, which became the case in the 1990s with the FARC, and then the urban centers mobilize, push back, and suppress the simmer. And so the question is whether in this peace process, this time along, the process will move beyond simply putting out the fire and beyond moving to not just bringing the boil to a simmer, but actually removing the fire that fuels it underneath, and the fire being the underdevelopment, the systematic underdevelopment and inequality of the country. And the document, the book really, the 400-page peace treaty, which is, as my colleagues mentioned, really unprecedented in the level of detail that it's specified, critically promised that the rural spaces would be developed. Now, the challenge of it was always going to be enormous. The amount of time the development would take and the amount of resources and basic redistribution, not simply from the elite, but really from middle class in Colombia, urban middle class, and quite vulnerable lower urban middle class that would have to be bearing a lot of the economic costs of redistribution, was going to be an enormously difficult social project to sustain. And that's indeed turning out the case, where the document in its first enormously raised expectation of the rural areas that they would see development very rapidly. And it's not happening. It's not happening because it was structurally impossible to happen, and it's also not happening because of the Duque administration that has not had very much motivation. It's administration that's much more closely linked to landed elites, the traditional power structures in Colombia that hated the peace accords, that found many of the details of the peace accords badly designed. They rejected it. Even today. High Colombian officials will say that the peace accords were terribly designed and they are now saddled with implementing very bad peace accords. So you have the combination of political will significantly lacking with enormous structural problems and very large raised expectations that all that had to be tempered, but instead were inflamed. So the implementation of the rural reform is going very, very slowly. And there are many dimensions to it, one of which is that, as you mentioned, coca is thriving. Now that was, again, I think, kind of systemic delusion that many of the negotiators of the peace deal, including on the international side, allowed themselves to be captured by, where it was clear that coca would be in Colombia for a long time to come, and not talking years, but really talking decades. Whereas the whole mood around the negotiations was that the deal would somehow be a magic wand that would undo coca. That was never going to happen, and it exploded full force. Both the illusion exploded and coca cultivation exploded. Now, an element of that is that the government, the Santos government in the agreement, promised a very badly designed crop substitution program that was significant even in using a very outdated term and outdated concept, but nonetheless sold over 100,000 families of the cocaleros, of people who cultivate coca, onto the plan. That was problematic in its original design, but now on top of that, the Duque administration has not wanted to fund it. And the program has replicated the same vice, the same problems, the same structural misdesign that every single iteration of Colombia's alternative livelihoods, crop substitution, alternative development has gone back since the 1980s, where the farmers are asked to eradicate all of their coca a priori, and then as a condition, and then given some amount of time that varies, 6 months, 8 months. In the current version, it's 2 years of direct financial support that's really quite small, and promise that all kinds of other structural development, infrastructure, microcredit titling, value-added chains, businesses would arrive. That has never happened. Meanwhile, they forego all of their income, and within the 2-year span, they are bitterly disappointed and feel betrayed, and now have gone through an version of exactly the same design that has never worked well. And so, many of the families that have eradicated, that sign up still in the Santos administration, are now coming close to ending their 2 years of money, and meanwhile, they have seen essentially no development. The Duque administration has suspended some of the payments and has been very halting with the payments. So there is a lot of anger building up, and a lot of the families feel essentially betrayed, that officials persuaded them to eradicate their coca, and they have not delivered any of the promises of legal livelihoods. Now, I'll end by mentioning the international context, which is, of course, the US, and particularly the Trump administration, that has put a lot of pressure on the Duque administration to significantly suppress coca. In many ways, the Trump administration is very much a throwback to kind of the doctrinaire version of US drug policies of the late 80s, early 1990s, with some of the biggest problems of the drug orthodoxy. And the Duque administration has been under pressure from Trump, and so has resurrected rather aggressive forced eradication to bring coca down. And that's generating all kinds of social disquiet, strengthening some of the political capital that FARC used to have, and creating frictions and making people far less willing to accept state presence.
So as I recall it, the Trump administration asked the Duque government to agree to cutting coca production in half in a year.
Right. Well, so that it was a negotiated process. The Duque administration was also putting out very significant numbers. So it was not simply the number that came out of Washington or that came out of the White House. It was multiple set of processes. You can cut the number. The question is how long can you sustain it, and at what cost, and at how rapidly it will come back. So, and they have not achieved that, but they are putting forth very significant increases in eradication, which is no doubt the case, because as you know well, the Santos administration suspended forced eradication and suspended aerial spraying for several years. So they're showing big numbers this year. They did not get this certified. Trump 2 years ago threatened, a year ago threatened that Colombia would get this certified. Whether that threat was ever credible or not was a question, but you had delegations of officials from Colombia coming to Washington, very concerned. Even in July, at the time, the foreign minister was here, and they were really concerned that they could get this certified, but they delivered enough numbers of eradication to avoid it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Sarah, I wanted to ask you, what effect have the dissidences of the FARC? So many FARC units have refused to demobilize, including the First Front in southern Colombia and other smaller units. What effect has that had on the peace process?
Yeah, so I think this kind of goes back to the larger question of what effect Duque has had on the implementation. And Duque was elected on the back of the plebiscite. The plebiscite campaign was essentially an Uribista campaign against it, on which he structured his electoral campaign. And so in terms of what effect he's had, his election and his presidency, he's given voice to those who objected the process. And to please his support base and his constituents, he has an incentive not to implement the peace process. So what is the result of this? And this will get back to the recidivism and remilitarization question, and dissidence question. So first of all, one of the major opposition was about the HEP, the transitional justice system, and going to sort of war against the HEP, and going to war even against the national narrative about what this conflict is. And so I think one of the major results of Duque, or imprints of his presidency on the implementation of the peace process, has been to put in charge of the Center of Historic Memory somebody who denies that the conflict ever occurred, that characterizes it as a one-way, asymmetric war of narco-terrorism against a state rather than a civil war in which there is responsibility on both the guerrilla side, but also the state side, and of course the paramilitary side. And so I think that the national narrative that will come out of this could be affected by the Duque presidency. The transitional justice process, by undermining the legitimacy of it, has massive numbers. The largest victims organization, FEVCOL, which amasses 215,000 victims of the FARC, they're not participating in it because it's been so delegitimized. So in my mind, it's unclear what the transitional justice process, how it will survive this presidency. At the same time, the benefit of having a divided government, and Duque does not have a majority in Congress, means that he is not able to dismantle, and for other reasons related to the court decisions, he cannot dismantle the peace process. So instead, it's just stalling. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens over time. But one of the issues with poor implementation and this very large risk that the government will renege is that what we know about peace processes is that for them to go through, armed groups and former combatants have to believe that the government will follow through on its promises. And if they believe that the government will not do so, they have incentives to return to violence. And so the fact that this is a democratic country in which the government side upholding its side of the agreement is beholden to a public who's able to vote on the terms, ironically has made the government not a credible bargainer and willing to renege on some of its promises. Does this lead to the dissidence and the remilitarization? I'm not sure that is correct. With the paramilitaries, the process with the paramilitaries, there were a few factions that never entered the process, really only two. But most factions entered, and then a large number returned to violence after having entered the peace process, handed over their weapons, demobilized. With the FARC, there is one difference, which is that a large number of what are called the dissidents never entered the process. They were against the process to begin with. Therefore, the government's poor implementation can't cause their decision never to enter the process. Did Ivan Marquez and others factions that have since left the process claim that it's the government's reneging and the fact that they're not implementing, and that has been used for good for people who would like the peace process to be implemented, pointing, look, if we don't implement, people are going to return to violence. I'm not sure. He was pretty against it to begin with. I'm not sure that really is his motivation. And the challenge with claiming that the government reneging is causing some groups within the FARC to return to violence is that there are a large number who, with the same conditions and the same government reneging, are deciding to stick with the process. That said, where I think that the government's poor implementation due to Duque's electoral incentives not to implement is having an effect is that there are large numbers of ex-combatants who are in limbo. They just don't know what their future holds, if the government will continue to pay them, if the government will provide any of their security guarantees. And so especially mid-ranking commanders and rank and file are very likely to return to violence under those circumstances of uncertainty.
Just what I wanted
Yes.
to add to the remilitarization issue. You yourself in the introduction, of course, pointed out that FARC is not the sole armed group. And so even before we saw the Santrich and Marquez factions returning rather dramatically to the battlefield and calling for others to return in August, and before we saw other of the dissidents returning back to the fight in various forms, the conflict quite significantly intensified in some areas. And so ironically, the immediate post-peace process was one where in some parts conflict went down significantly and others intensified as the FARC vacated areas and the bandas criminales, the criminal groups, and other political actors, armed political actors, not the least of which the ELN, but also even major Mexican drug cartels became involved in a very complex fight over control of multiple set of resources, timber, gold, and obviously drugs. And so that again is a structural condition that has been systematic in Colombia, that since really the 1980s and arguably even prior, the various peace processes often focus on a group. But the other structural, both the structural sources of conflict persist and other armed actors operate in the space and manage to pull down the promise, the peace dividend managed to weaken it significantly, and oftentimes you end up with the next very violent cycle of the conflict.
Right, and that's why I don't think that the reneging sort of hypothesis is what is driving the remilitarization, because instead what you're having is the FARC concentrated in certain very specific veredas where they set up camps and they left large territories that they had governed and controlled territorially in a power vacuum, which just had all other groups sort of flock to the region and create all sorts of violence to try to control what are very lucrative resources in those areas. And the state wasn't able to occupy and state build sufficiently for all the reasons that Vanda has said, in an effort to control those areas, so they didn't become these places of infighting between the different groups. So I think that was
sort of ambivalent about
right.
occupying those spaces.
Right.
And
I just wanted to add to that I think that there are different interpretations of the FARC dissidences right now in Colombia, and some people will argue that there is a risk that they can become more centralized, or that there is kind of the same thing. I really think that's not the case, and it's very territorial. So it's clear that some of the factions that reneged the agreement in the first place, some of them were more political and some of them were more criminal. And I don't think there is a way to really, it may happen, and if there is more political uncertainty, that can create different incentives for maybe the political component to become stronger. But I think right now, depending on the calculations, there may be somewhere between 20 and 28 dissidences across the country. But there is no clear leadership on them, even after Marquez left the process officially. So these are very different factions, and they all have different configurations of power depending where they are. And the calculations, again, these are preliminary. People say there may be over 2,500 combatants in this. But I think most of the evidence seems to suggest that most of these are new recruits. But as in Sarah's work is shown, like these middle-ranking commanders can make a big difference. And the more uncertain the demobilization process becomes, the more that low-level people can go back. I don't think necessarily it's going to happen with the people who are already demobilized, but there is no shortage of people who don't have other options who can end up going to these groups in Colombia.
So I wanted to actually put you on the spot a little bit, Angelica, because your book makes this argument about how when you have when you have multiple different organizations operating in the same space, especially organizations who are outsourcing the violence or who may not have the most disciplined cadres, that tends to result in explosions of violence. If you take that analysis, right, which you built for urban Colombia and urban Mexico, and then apply it in rural areas, that sort of paints a very bad prognosis of Colombia with remobilizations, new cadres, the ELN and the EPL expending their turf, making what appear to be at times unstable alliances with Mexican drug cartels, ex-paramilitary groups. I'd like you to talk a little bit about sort of the relevance of your analysis of cities to the
So I think, of course, I mean, we're talking of rural and urban areas. There are big differences, but I do think that some basic elements kind of remain relevant. And I think it's not surprise for people to think that if you have multiple groups fighting and present in a territory, you may have more fighting. You may have also alliances too, and there is interesting work by Annette Idler and interesting work that shows that even in places where you have a lot of groups, you can have alliances between those groups. And I think that that's where you see in a lot of places, especially in the border areas with Venezuela, with Ecuador, with Brazil right now. But even if there are alliances, those alliances are unstable. So yes, I do think that the fact that there are so many groups and they are so fragmented, that creates a lot of security concerns. And if you look at the areas of Colombia that have more problems with security right now, are areas where multiple groups are operating, and that's the Catatumbo in the northeastern part of the country, and that's the Pacific coast. So regions where you have the FARC dissidences, but you also have the ELN, you have whatever version of criminal gangs and the whatever version of the EPL, their factions. So it's in those places where we have most of the insecurity concentrated right now. Now, the difference though is that because also there are, in Colombia, and this is my overall reading of how criminality in Colombia has evolved, there is a learning process. And I think that because the police in Colombia has gained more capacity, it is true that at some level, all criminals know that if they become too visible, at some point they're going to become targets of the state, and they get easily caught. So that creates certain limits to how far they will go in the kind of violence they use. But I think those differences are less consequential for the people in their communities. So put it in other terms, I think that criminal factions will be more careful of fighting the state directly or careful of going after national targets. But I think locally there is not much that will restrain them from using a lot of violence. And in the end, the people who suffer this violence the most are people in these rural areas, the coca growers who want to move away from coca but who can't because they have too many groups pressuring them to go back to coca crops and sell them to them. So yes, I think in general there is no coincidence in the power fragmentation. In the places where there are more groups vying for control is where we have more security concerns. And it's clear also that some of the spaces left by the FARC as brokers, even in the illegal economies and in the coca, have also created more space for other groups to try and see, who can, who's going to control, who can get more space. It's clear, and I was in Medellin over the summer, and everywhere in the country, of course, there is more of a talk of Mexican organizations coming in. I also think that this talk of Mexican organizations always tends to be a little taken out of proportion and exaggerated, but it's happening and it's there. And I think that has to do with there is uncertainty about who's going to control, and the Mexican organizations are mostly interested in making sure that they get their products, so they are coming to make sure that the agreements are done. And in some cases, that's evolving into more control. I don't think that there is more presence, but I'm always a little bit more skeptical and taking at face value all the talk about like Mexican organizations are controlling like territory in Colombia. But there is definitely also an increasing presence of them in the territory, and that's another group added to this cacophony of groups in the territory.
So Sarah, I wanted to ask you now, what effects are the killing of peasant leaders and the guerrillas and demobilized guerrillas having on the peace process?
Well, I do think that in terms of thinking about what's happening right now with the protests, which it's impossible to. I was supposed to be in Medellin last week, and I wasn't able to do some of the work that I was doing because of the mass protests. And the part that is related to the peace process is coming out of that, with the indigenous from Cauca coming up to the cities to participate in the protests, the sort of outrage at the levels of violence against social leaders that echoes what happened in the 1980s, and I think that there is anger and indignation about these killings. The killings of demobilized guerrillas, while over 100 now, with the paramilitary process, it was in the thousands. So it's fairly normal for former combatants, tragically, to be targeted. I think there's less attention given to the cases because it's often assumed that there was a reason that that they were involved in illicit activity or had some connections that made them targets of the violence. And I think that that's not always fair, and that some of these are genuine victims and need to be investigated fully. The interesting thing about these protests, though, that I've been watching really carefully is that it's quite surprising. What they're asking for has very little to do with the peace process. These are not protests about peace, violence, security. These are protests mostly about minimum wage, about pensions, about union rights, about all sorts of sort of normal economic issues, inequality, corruption, not about the peace process. And to read it as about the peace process for people who study the peace process would be incorrect, which I think is a good sign that Colombia is moving to be sort of a post-conflict country where people's concerns are there's a very large myriad of concerns beyond just security, because oftentimes we think that without security you can't have a lot of these other concerns. And so it means that there's some minimum level of security that people's concerns are becoming more diverse. I also think it's a very positive sign that we're seeing the freedom and the ability to mobilize and protest, and for the left to have been liberated from an armed left that didn't allow it to take to the streets in protest. At the same time, we're seeing relatively heavy-handed police response, which is a legacy of Uribe and Duque being the president. And so it's unclear where this will go. I think there's really strong demonstration effects, so it's unclear if we would have seen this mobilization if we hadn't had Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador in the streets as well. So it's hard to say this was a sort of an indigenous or born within Colombia movement. That said, these protests are having a massive influence on these countries. A new constitution in Chile, overthrowing president in Bolivia. And so a question is sort of what will be the result, with a potential backlash for people who feel that this is not happening through a democratic process, and that it's happening through people taking to the streets versus through the ballot box. But I think it's a very fascinating process, something we haven't seen in Colombia in decades, to have this level of protest, but then also to have curfews and a police response. So this is all sort of uncharted territory for Colombia, but has a lot of promise.
The issue of the protest also links back to your very opening question, Desmond, about why did newly elected President Santos, and really even when he was running for president, started contemplating, negotiating, and starting preparing the ground already during his electoral campaign for negotiations with the FARC. It was very much a response to the Colombian society, particularly urban Colombian society, wanting to move away from the focus on security and the various security taxes and focus on socioeconomic issues. And Santos understood that the weight and support that Uribe had in his first term and then his second term now waned, and that the focus now was on socioeconomic issues. But in order to deliver on socioeconomic issues, Santos had to move to a situation where we would not have that same level of expenditures and same level of insecurity. So the peace process was also a way to focus on bread and butter issues as opposed to guns. That would be the urban vote. And then, of course, it became very much entangled with his legacy, the Nobel Peace Prize, and other sorts of issues.
I will say, and I just want to add that I absolutely agree with everything that has been said, and I agree that this protest is much more than the peace process, but I will say, though, that it is, for a sector of the population, it is still a concern. It's probably one of the things that has been voiced, and as many, probably not so much as in Bolivia, but as many protests, I think there are many centers and many kind of, not everybody is mobilizing exactly with the same agenda. It's kind of this general sense that it's about socioeconomic issues and the economic policies that Duque stands for. You know, the first thing the president said is that, oh, I have not presented any reforms, but people have read very clearly from many things what the intentions with reforms are. But I will say that for many, the issue of the peace agreement and the lack of implementation is there, and I think in that sense it's important also to highlight that not too long ago, one of the things that made people very mad in Colombia also is what happened with the bombing of a bombing of a campment that led to the killing of 7 children, and that the government response was simply, you know, they had been forcibly recruited. We were doing what we needed to do without necessarily recognizing any mistake, and I think that also mobilized a lot of people saying, you know, this is just not right. You know, the government cannot say, like, even if they are recruiting forcibly, that this cannot be the response of a legitimate government. So I do think that even though it's clear that security is not there, that the election, even with Duque winning, the fact that it was such a close election also showed that the Colombian electorate wants to move and has changed. I mean, this is also generational change. But it's this tension between wanting to move away from that security agenda, but also that still being very much part of what many sectors of the population have, and that's the indigenous people moving to Bogota, because for them, that's the issue. For them, it's not so much the minimum wage, but it's about making sure that there is security in their territories.
But also there is a disconnect in the what people wanted and the fact that the politicians are mostly, we're talking about the peace process and we're talking about security. So there is also that disconnect. And I think it's a really interesting question where you're seeing all these protests around the world and especially across Latin America of why now? There's been massive corruption for so long. Why are people all of a sudden fed up with corruption? Why there's been inequality for so long? Why are people all of a sudden sort of, you know, really rising up about inequality? And there have been these types of political killings for a long time as well. So it's an interesting question of trying to understand what makes people sort of take to the streets and be sort of fed up and want change.
So we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to do my best to get through the questions, but there are a lot of questions. I might have to combine some of them, and we may not be able to get to all of them. The first question we have is, what effect does instability, and I would add migration from Venezuela, having on the Colombian peace process?
Well, I can take it. I know that we all can talk. I mean, I will say, it has an enormous impact because basically we have an enormous sector of the population that is not protected, that it's also receiving very strong rejection from the Colombian population. And what this means is also that there is vulnerable population that can be easily recruited for illegal activities, for example, in the border areas. So I think, but there is also, and I will say this very strongly, there is also, being a Colombian, every time that I go to Colombia and I have a conversation about Venezuela, it makes my skin cringe because suddenly everything has become the problem with the Venezuelan migrants. So crime is a result of having Venezuelan migrants. Like the insecurity in the border is having Venezuelan migrants, which I think is very disingenuous of us Colombians, knowing that we have the long problems that we have, pretend that everything is a result of having Venezuelans in the country. So they kind of personally put a very strong position against saying the problems we're having come from having Venezuelan migrants. But of course, we have a very vulnerable population. We have an enormous amount of, like a very massive population that is coming to the country, that is stranded in many ways. Some of them are staying in the borders. And this just makes for a very complicated cocktail. And especially because the areas that I mentioned before, that are some of the most vulnerable now in security terms are also areas where there are large concentrations of Venezuelan migrants. So it kind of adds to a very complicated situation. But yes, I will say it's very important to kind of react against that narrative of, all the problems suddenly are the result of Venezuela having problems and having Venezuelan migrants, which is, that's a very strong narrative among certain people and certain politicians in Colombia.
And there's a collapsing of a lot of security threats and collapsing a very specific, completely exogenous shock of Venezuela imploding and sending many migrants with the peace process and the fact that the Venezuelan government was supporting the FARC and is left. And so somehow there's this sort of cognitive relationship being created and beneficial to the political right that the migrant crisis and the peace process are tied when they're not actually linked. And if anything, people who are fleeing Venezuela tend to be not leftists, otherwise they wouldn't be fleeing for political reasons, and not going to turn Colombia into Venezuela.
So we have another set of questions on U.S. policy towards Venezuela. So U.S. policy towards Colombia. How is U.S. policy toward Colombia affecting the peace process? And what can the U.S. do to help Colombia in the peace process?
Well, in the Trump administration, the strongest focus really has been on the drug issue. And particularly as fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid, is increasingly mixed into not just opioids like heroin, but also into cocaine and methamphetamines. There was a significant spike. There has been a significant spike in deadly cocaine overdose as well, and that's linked to fentanyl. Nonetheless, that became a very important point for the Trump administration to push for significant eradication and suppression of coca. That said, even the Obama administration, toward its end, was really running out of patience and wanted to see suppression of coca. So it was not simply linked to Trump, although the way President Trump went about demanding it was dramatic and significant, and threatening the certification was a very significant thing. Colombia is fortunate in the sense that it enjoys very strong bilateral support, bipartisan support rather, in the US Congress. There is a lot of support for Colombia, a lot of engagement for Colombia. But that said, while the Obama administration was very intimately involved with the peace process and played a very quiet but very important and significant role in the Havana peace process, really was a key quiet enabler. The Trump administration has not been very much interested in the issue. It has not been interested in implementation. It has been deaf and oblivious to the way that eradication undermines and the peace process and is counterproductive to the peace process. Has not been interested in the details of implementation of a variety of the peace-building processes, economic development processes, rule of reforms, and really its focus in Latin America has almost solely been on Venezuela. And in fact, from the very early days of the Trump administration, it has sought to bring the Maduro regime down, and it has at various points pulled various Latin American countries into Colombia into attempting to bring the Maduro regime down, and failed at it and has no plan and doesn't know what to do while Maduro is surviving and destroying the population of the country. But I want to highlight one important point about US policy that is not linked to who is in government, but has to do with US laws. And specifically material support for organizations that are designated as terrorist groups. So the FARC, before the peace process, was designated as a terrorist group, and there is really no way to come off the designation. So even after the peace process, the FARC is still designated as a terrorist group, even though entity with that same name, FARC, is now a political party. But any kind of material support is violations of U.S. laws. And so U.S. policy right now, at the moment that any entity is designated as a terrorist group, cannot provide any kind of material assistance, financial material assistance that would in any way trickle down to that group. So right now, U.S. government officials cannot buy the FARC a cup of coffee, even if the FARC is a political entity. Now, I'm being facetious in the cup of coffee, although it is true at that level, it would still be significant violation of U.S. law with vast set of punitive implications. But far more importantly, the U.S. cannot provide any kind of DDR assistance to FARC. It cannot participate or financially support any kind of projects in which FARC would be one of the participants along with other members. So while the material support laws that have been embraced at the global level, really exported by the United States and inculcated at the UN level, make perhaps sense in deterring material support, they become enormously problematic in the peace phase, in the post-negotiations phase, and are very problematic in the Colombian context.
What is the state of negotiations with the ELN? And are the ELN, and what effects will that have on the peace process?
So I would say just there is none. It's completely, there was a possibility when the government started. That's clearly something that is not in the political spectrum right now. And again, that has to do with Duque not, from the very beginning, taking some steps that really basically created obstacles and the impossibility of advancing in the negotiation with the ELN, and at the same time you have this process of expansion of the ELN, which I don't think anybody has quite understood quite well. Why they took this opportunity as the FARC had left the space and started expanding. So I think the easy answer, and probably of course is the strongest one, is that they saw the opportunity to basically seize these illegal economies that in the spaces that the FARC was leaving to expand themselves again. I think might be a little bit more complicated than that, but that's a big factor. But what makes it very complicated with the ELN is that the ELN resisted for decades, for its history, engaging with those economies. Mm-hmm. So I think the fact that they did right now is precisely because it also gave them that opportunity to expand themselves politically, but as they get more engaged in illegal economies, that political agenda that seemed to be stronger in the ELN also starts to become a little bit more blurry. It doesn't disappear as it didn't disappear with the FARC, but becomes more complicated. So the more the ELN expands, the more it becomes engaged in these complicated relationships with illegal economies and with other groups. It also complicates the negotiation process itself. So Personally, I don't think there will be more advances in this government. I don't think that's which is a shame, because I think some progress had been made. And when the Santos government was leaving, I think there was an advance with the teams that were trying to negotiate with the ELN. But as happens in any peace process, I think of course the ELN also made this, conducted attacks and everything. That of course is a way of showing power, but of course it delegitimizes and puts the government also in a difficult position. And then of course we have a government that didn't want to negotiate. So I think that political space is closed for now.
And I think it's different than with the FARC, where the FARC, even though it has displayed a lack of cohesion since the peace process, was cohesive at the negotiating table and was centralized and with commanders who were able to speak on behalf of the organization, whereas the ELN has not exhibited that level of cohesion. And it's still unclear the major attacks in Bogota during who is orchestrating the attacks, who was serious about negotiating peace. Was it a display of strength in order to move the concessions and gain greater concessions, or was it a spoiling of the peace process because there were fronts that were not interested in the negotiations, given the opportunities provided by the FARC demobilization? So I think it's more complicated, but I think that Angelica is exactly correct that we're unlikely to see the process come to a close. I do think that Duque might continue to negotiate, but he'll get very little credit for that.
Can you talk about illegal gold mining and the effect that illegal gold mining is having on the conflict in Colombia?
Well, I would say that it's just one of the resources that is both providing physical strength to armed groups, but also is one of the stimuli for conflict in the country. But I think it's more interesting and significant is that Colombian government officials, Colombian elite, for a very long time had this narrative that it is the presence of illicit resources, particularly coca, that was the driver of conflict. So if you undo coca, you will have conflict end. And it is still today very much part of thinking in the Duque administration, but has its antecedents way before that, and is quite consistent across Colombian administration. It was certainly true about key designers of President Santos's policies, key designers of President Uribe's policies. And I think that the gold is significant in the sense that it, in some important way, discredits that argument. It's a legal commodity, and you could turn it into an illegal fueling of warfare. You can perhaps operate on the fantasy that you can undo coca in Colombia. You cannot quite operate on the fantasy that you can remove the timber, that you can remove the gold. And that should, it's about the capacity of actors with territorial control or territorial influence to mobilize essentially any commodity for both physical strength, for both material resources, but also political capital. Now, then we can talk about dimensions of how gold mining is specifically playing out with different groups, but I'm aware of the time and want to allow more questions.
Can I add something quickly to that?
Sure.
I will just say that one thing that we have not, where I think we can have more research and really see what's happening is how this, so coca and gold, how specifically they were interacting, because so many things, we mentioned at the very beginning, the increase in coca crops that occurred starting around 2014. And of course, the first reaction for people, this is just the result of a stop in fumigation, but the more information we have is clear that there was a bunch of causes behind that increase. And one of those is that there was a decline in coca, in the price of gold, and an increase in the price of coca. So that those two created also a different supply and demand relationship, so that I think it's interesting to see to what extent coca and gold complement each other, but also at some level they are kind of substitutes, not complete substitutes, because it's clear that this has to do with just like many economies that is just not coca anymore, and it's just the complete, in the Venezuelan border it has to do with food, it's like gasoline. Yeah. So, but that there is this interesting dynamic, especially with coca and gold, because they are the most transnational commodities, I will say, with the prices maybe playing kind of a replacing role between these two economies that I think we still need to learn more about.
What do you see as the future of Colombia's left, and what will be FARC's legacy?
So I'll jump in on the sort of the political party that the FARC has created, which is guaranteed 5 seats in Senate, 5 seats in Congress for 2 electoral cycles, but had to decided to contest the elections and put forth a full list of candidates, and did horribly in the congressional elections. Pulled their presidential candidate, Timochenko, for health reasons, but also because he was polling dismally. So the FARC got less than 1% of the congressional vote share. And this is after public opinion polls showed sort of between 7% in non-conflict areas, even up to 15% of voters in conflict areas saying that they would be willing to vote for a FARC candidate. So, and then in the local elections, where people believed that given FARC's very strong and decades-long history in a lot of regions, people thought that they would at least be able to capture some of the local governments, the mayor and the governorships in their territories, and they performed very dismally in the local elections as well. And so I think that we have to explain why they performed so poorly. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But in terms of the where I do think that they are having an influence that we don't really see, because I think they're discounted because they've performed so poorly electorally. But they have 10 people in Congress, and they're forming sort of coalitional blocks and having an influence on legislation. And so I think that they are having an influence on politics. But what has been more remarkable has been the incredible role of the left. The left had not made it to performed as well in a presidential election, winning major cities, including Bogota, performing well even in the Uribista sort of territory of Antioquia in the latest elections. And so what we're seeing is a lot of room being given to the left. People can explain this in a lot of different ways. Generational changes, urbanization, more progressive, which sort of tracks with the voting patterns of the last election. But at the same time, I do wonder the elite has been divided, the traditional elite, the traditional parties have been divided. And as the left surges, I wonder if there will be sort of a unifying of the sort of traditional parties in order to counter that leftist force. But also another explanation for the left is that it doesn't have this tainting of having an armed left anymore. In terms of the FARC's poor political performance, I think in large part, of course, they're lacking financing, they're a new party, et cetera. But they also did very little to change their image. They did change their name, but they kept like Fuerza y Revolucionaria in their name, which is not showing a lot of change. They have a red rose, which is red, the color of blood. They didn't do enough to change. I've interviewed all of the top FARC commanders in the party, and they didn't want to change their platform. They didn't want to change their essence, and they didn't do enough to apologize for their violence and take sort of a path of contrition. And so I think that is reflected, of course, also having the alternative of the modernized legal left. But
so, can I add something? I'm adding something, sorry. But I think Sarah just said everything very well. But I will say that definitely, as Sarah said, as I mentioned too, the fact that there is no stigma for the left that has created more there is no FARC, and that kind of takes away the stigma of the armed force, has opened the space for people to vote and for politicians to be more open. But I also think that there is, I think what that has created is more space for the left in the center. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there is that much space for the left on the extremes, and I think that's also clear. That's also possible with the right. Mm-hmm. So support for Uribe apparently right now is at the lowest. Mm-hmm. So according to some polls, it's at 26%, mm-hmm. which is very low compared to what he used to have. And I think this also shows that that probably people in Colombia are more to trying to find that kind of a center that is also a little bit more progressive. And because the political landscape in Colombia is so fragmented, what that means is that there is sort of alliance making that needs to be done for people to win elections. Mm-hmm. And that's true for Uribe, that's true for Petro, that's true for anybody. So I think that because of that, I think it's unlikely that we'll have like this leftist clear force or party evolving. Even the Partido Verde, I don't think Partido Verde is left. It's kind of more progressive center. So I think that that's probably where the politics are going to move, with people trying to move away from the extremes, really.
Mm-hmm. So just to close, what's your vision for the future of the peace process, and where do you see Colombia in 10 years?
Easy question.
Briefly, from each of you.
Unfortunately, I think it will still be an enormously bifurcated country, parts of which will have experienced significant growth and progress, and large parts of which will not. And where there will be a lot of crush disappointment in many of the rural areas that believe they will have benefited from the peace process in fundamental ways. The question is the extent to which that disappointment will be there and the areas of that underdevelopment. I rather fear, and I think that was a problem in the very initial stages of the Santos negotiation, that it's not simply the elite that does not want to engage in the redistribution and the redesign of the social project, but it's the lower middle class in urban spaces that is progressing, slowly but progressing, but it does not want to be taxed. It does not want to see the redistribution to the rural areas. So it will be a complicated picture.
Zara?
So I think that this peace process is here to stay and that we won't see, as Angelica was seeing, another rise of another FARC. I think that violence, unfortunately, might be here to stay as long as we have the economic incentives for violence. I am hopeful that there might be some changes to the maquinaria and the political machine, and the rejection of the political machine could clean up politics and clientelism, but that's a big hope. And I agree that that inequality between the periphery and and sort of the Cordillera is also unlikely to change dramatically, but the massive shifts in the population promise that urban areas will be where a majority of the already a majority of the population, but that will probably only continue, and thus hopefully the need for redistribution back to rural areas will be lessened.
Well, they have put it so well that I don't know if I have much to add. But yeah, I echo those comments. Especially for some of the areas where security is more complicated right now, I think unfortunately those places probably are not likely to see an improvement in the near future. And I think that's the worst part of this, for people in the Pacific coast and in the border with Ecuador, in the border with Venezuela. Those are areas that I don't think their security situation is going to improve in the near future, unfortunately. Studying drug policy, I don't think, unfortunately, we're going to see any radical change with the way legal economies work in the country and the way drug trafficking and coca production are still, unless there was a commitment to really something different. And again, I don't think that's going to happen in this government. But then again, like some of these changes we've been talking about are positive. I think it's important to keep in mind still that 13,000 combatants demobilized, and for the most part they have stayed there, and I think that's a big win. The changes that we've been talking about in the population are positive, and I think that's a good change for the country. And I don't think, unfortunately, that the inequality, both in terms of class but also in terms of region, as Vanda was saying, I don't think that's also going to change. And there is a lot of hope with the protests and what they can bring, but I don't know how long that's going to be sustained. And we're entering the holiday season in Colombia, which means most likely the protests are going to wind down. And I think the government hasn't taken any clear steps towards to take seriously the demands of some of the protests. And so the potential of changing economic policy, I don't think is gonna change. And in that sense, I think Colombia's most persistent problem, which is inequality, is gonna stay there for a while.
Okay, well, thank you so much to our presenters and to the audience for coming tonight, and for closing out this semester in the Marx Global Insights series. Have a good evening.